Okay. Okay, thank you, Rabbanit Laura, for having me for this three-part series together on the fashion of our forebears, whatever term you prefer. I'm going to try something that's going to be quite difficult. This was a 15-week course, and I'm trying to cut down into 3 weeks. So I'm going to try spot the highlights from a 15-week course and really just try to get a general overview of what fashion means to us in Judaism. Let's start off putting it to the floor to all of you. And please, Laura, can then do that? Does everyone have the ability to unmute themselves?
Yeah, I think they should.
Good. So please don't leave it to me to talk for the next 35 minutes. I want to hear your opinions and your views. And I'm really going to throw you into the deep end. I want to ask you, or at least to think, when you wake up in the morning and you go to your wardrobe, do you think about what you're going to wear? Or do you just take the first thing that comes out? How much do the clothing that we wear, how much do they make us who we are? How much do we let the clothes that we wear define us? And in what way does your clothing define you? When you look at somebody else, do you take cognizance of the clothes that they're wearing on a conscious level, on a subconscious level? Or, they could be wearing anything and it would all be the same. How much does clothing define us as individuals, number one, and how much does it influence how much we see other people? At this stage, I want to open to the floor. Let's hear anyone got any opinions?
Definitely makes a difference, because if you're going into a business meeting and you're wearing a schlocky, messy outfit, people won't think you're very professional. If you go in wearing a suit or something similar, they'll think, oh, this is a professional person I can take seriously.
Okay, so you're raising an interesting point, and we'll discuss it more this week and next week, is that it will have an effect of what the other person thinks of you. But is that necessarily who you are? Meaning, if I know I'm going to a job interview, and I know I have to put on a tie and suit and I have to get dressed smart, but I'm a bit of a schlock. So does the clothes that I'm wearing really define me, or am I putting a facade on for the interview?
So I worked 2 years ago. I used to work for Satmar High School. So I had to put on clothes for that. I mean, yes, I try and dress modestly, but I really had to dress to fit their mold. I have to say, it did have a positive influence, I think, on how I continued to dress afterwards. But I did, my girls used to laugh and they used to say, oh, it's the Satmar wardrobe today, because that was the day I was working. So yes, I think sometimes you do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a friend who wanted to take a job to be a mashgiach on a cruise ship. And they would only take him on as a mashgiach if he grew a beard, because they said that people will appreciate his kashrut more and feel more comfortable with his kashrut if he looked like a frum Jew with a beard. I guess I could never be a mashgiach on a ship, anyway. But maybe there's something to it, that the way people perceive us, that creates a certain reality and a certain responsibility. So there's really two questions over here. I think Samantha, I think you kind of hit it on the head, that there's two separate questions over here that we have to deal with. Is how does our clothing define us? Does it express who we are? And how do other people look at us because of the clothes that we wear? Two separate questions. Does my clothing really represent who I am? And how much can I put on clothing and let that clothing be a facade of who I really am? And in order to judge this question, we're going to look at different places in Tanakh where clothing comes up. And let's jump straight into it, because clothing comes up right at the very beginning in Bereshit. Just before we look at the story in Bereshit, as a disclosure, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Amital, from the Gush, he used to say, he used to get up every year on Shabbat Bereshit, on the first parsha of the year, And it was the first big Shabbat, and all the Bachorim wanted to hear what Rav Amital going to say on Shabbat Bereshit, the first Shabbat of the year. And he got up and he said, I'm not giving a drosha this Shabbos. Because he said, I simply don't understand the story of creation. And he sat down. That's a Rosh Hashiva. And he had 300 students waiting to listen to what he had to say on Bereshit. He wouldn't say anything because he really felt he didn't understand the story of Bereshit. So we're going to look a bit at the story of Bereshit, but I'm just saying before that, a lot of Bereshit is hard to appreciate and to understand. So let's try nonetheless go through Bereshit and get some insights into our question about clothing. Okay, let's move on. Okay, in the beginning, how were Adam and Eve clothed? So let's see what the Torah says. Yushnehem arumim, Adam v'ishto v'lo hit oshashu. The two of them, man and woman, were naked, and they didn't get embarrassed. Now, how are we to understand the fact that Adam and Eve weren't embarrassed of their nakedness? You know, we see somebody that's not clothed, we feel ashamed for them. And when you're watching the cricket sometimes, and you see somebody running across the pitch not clothed, that's annoying. And you seriously think that the person, you know, like this person's got no self-dignity if they're prepared to run across a field without any clothes on. And yet, for Adam and Eve, it wasn't a problem. And I know some of you might dress your animals up. You might put your dogs in, you know, a sweater or something like that. But we don't get ashamed or embarrassed if an animal walks around without any clothes on. So, two questions I have. Number one, why do we want human beings to be clothed and animals we don't have a problem with? And number two, what changed in the Garden of Eden? Why was it okay for Adam and Eve to walk around the Garden of Eden at first, and they were naked and it didn't bother them and they weren't ashamed? What happened in the Garden of Eden? What I want to do is also focus on this word that we have. Both of them were naked. Arumim, they were naked. The word naked is arum. Let's look at the word, because often when you have a word in Hebrew, it's not random. The word tells us about deeper connotations that that word might have. The word arum. Anyone know a bit of Hebrew? Can tell me a bit about the word arum. What other word can you see in the word arum? Ayin Reish. Ayin Reish.
Is ear at all related, which means city? Doesn't look like it from your picture.
Oh, it's interesting. Ear, I'm not sure. I'm going to leave that to you to help me find a.
Look like it.
Maybe, but let's think about it. Very interesting that. Okay, let's put that to aside because definitely it's the same letters. The word er. What does er mean in Hebrew? I'm saying hitorari, wake up. The word er means the person is awake. Okay, so we've got the word er, and we've got the word or. What is or? With an ayin, means skin. Because seemingly between the word skin and nakedness, there's a connection. So or is skin, arum is naked, and er is awake. What's the connection between these three words? So let's start with the simplest one. Or is skin. What is the function of a person's skin? Or an animal skin for that matter? What does your skin do? It prevents any particles from entering into your body. Makes things not permeable. So it almost creates a barrier between what's on the outside and what's inside. Skin puts on a gate, a protection. And in a way, that's what being awake does. Because if you were sleeping, anyone can come and do something to you. When we were young and we used to, when we were at B'nai Akiva camp, I don't know what the English term is, but we called it raiding. When somebody's sleeping and you come with shaving cream and all other things. What's the English term? Is it also raiding? Okay, so we used to call it raiding. You used to go to someone with shaving cream and anything you could find, and take advantage of them in their vulnerable state. Because when a person is sleeping, they're vulnerable. You can permeate, so to speak, into their world. When a person's awake, they can defend themselves. They can stand up for themselves. There's a barrier. There's don't enter over here. And that's what your skin is. Your skin stops any foreign particles from coming in. How does nakedness connect to that? Well, most animals in the world go around naked and they feel fine. They don't feel exposed. They don't feel that there's any weakness to their world, and they're okay with it. Meaning, in a way, for them, nakedness allows them to conquer the world. They feel free and they can express themselves as they are, and they can carry on going around their lives. Maybe clothing for an animal would restrict it. Can you imagine an animal trying to get dressed? Wouldn't be able to move and conduct its life. So being naked in a way for an animal gives it ability to kind of go about in the world. Before the sin of Adam and Eve, they were naked and they were able to go freely and conduct themselves in the world. Live in paradise, live in Eden. Go with the flow of the world, be okay with the world. They were naked. They were protected in a way because they lived in this Garden of Eden, protected. Nothing could enter into their lives. And just like an animal that goes about the world and goes about its way and does its daily matters, Adam and Eve were the same in the Garden of Eden. Comes along the snake. The serpent, now this is an interesting word that it uses. The literal translation would be, the serpent was more cunning, was more deceptive than any other animal. That's how we traditionally translate this word. But what's the Hebrew word? Pay attention. Or more cunning. V'anachash haya harum. He was more naked than any other animal in the field. Asher asa Hashem Elokim. More naked than any other animal that God had made. Vayomer al ha'isha af ki amar Elohim no toflo mikol etz hagan. And he came to the woman and he said, as God indeed said to you, may you not eat from any of the trees of the garden. What does this verse tell us about the snake? He is more naked. Doesn't mean he is more cunning, he is more naked. Based on what we're saying about nakedness. He was totally part of nature. He totally felt protected by his environment. Nothing could permeate into his world. In figurative terms, he had a thick skin. Nothing could offend him. He could do what he wanted. He ruled that Garden of Eden. And thus, out of all the animals in the garden, he's the one that's not scared to go up to man and to Eve and to say, why don't you look at things a bit differently? Because the snake was happy just to go with the flow. He wasn't worried about consequence. He wasn't worried about the future. He just was happily going around the garden, living his everyday life. And indeed, he's so not worried about consequence that he doesn't realize that what he's going to do is actually going to have a big effect on himself and on the entire population inside the garden. And so there's any animal that's naked, that's the snake. Because he's really happy just to go about carrying on his life. He feels protected, he feels safe, nothing can enter into his environment. Adam and Eve are also protected. Remember, we said they're naked and they're not embarrassed. Why are they protected? Because in a way, in inverted commas, they're ignorant. What don't they eat from? They don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad. They're oblivious to good and bad. They're oblivious to what's right and wrong because they're just going with the flow. They're protected by God. They're protected by the garden. They're arum, they're naked, but they've also got aura. They've got a skin on. They've got a skin that's protecting them from any bad and any evil. And so what we have is, we have Adam and Eve that are naked. We've got the snake that is naked. And really what the statement of nakedness is in the Garden of Eden is that you can just kind of go with the flow. Kind of feel comfortable with your environment, let things sweep you away, and you don't have to take control. You don't need to know good and bad. You don't need to know right from wrong. You don't need knowledge. Says God to Adam and Eve, stay away from the tree of knowledge. Just live life happily. In other words, be like one of the animals. Do animals know the difference between right and wrong? Do animals know the difference between evil and good? They're just happy existing in their environment. And to a degree, before the sin in the Garden of Eden, that was Adam and Eve. They were happy just existing. They were happy just being. Happy being affected by the environment around them. And that's why the snake can come and can really manipulate both Adam and Eve and say, eat from the tree. It takes advantage of them because they're happy just going with the flow. The snake says, do something, yes, they'll do it. Essentially, what happened after the sin in the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, whatever that means, because really, like I said at the beginning, I don't know what it means that they ate from the tree of knowledge. But essentially what happened is they realized their nakedness. They got knowledge. They could not be products of their environment. What differentiates a man from an animal, man from animal, is the power of knowledge. Animals are happy being products of the environment. They're happy to go with the flow, like we said, where the mankind is commanded to take control of his environment, to be masters over this world. An animal cannot build a house. They can build a little habitat for themselves, but they cannot build houses and skyscrapers and the road systems that we have. They cannot manipulate the world. They cannot control the world because an animal is expected just to fit into the environment that he finds himself in. Man is expected, with the knowledge that he has, to take control of his environment. And that is expressed through nakedness and clothing. Because animals do not have clothing. And they're quite happy being naked. Why? Because they're just meant to fit into the environment. If they're cold, well, if they're a cold-blooded animal, then their body will regulate heat for them. If they're a warm-blooded animal, then their fur or their coat or whatever skin that they have will protect them and keep them warm. But to a large degree, and yes, you get different animals that have different degrees of intelligence, but as a whole, animals are a product of the environment. They expect it just to fit into the environment that they find themselves in. Mankind, on the other hand, is expected to go beyond the environment, to manipulate the environment. After Adam and Eve eat from that apple, there's no more Gan Eden, there's no more paradise. You can't just sit back and let God fend for you. You have to take control of your reality. You're no longer naked. Animals are naked. Animals are protected. You are not protected. You don't have that aura on you. You don't have that layer of protection on you. You have to go out there and clothe yourself. And so what happens is with Adam and Eve, essentially after the sin, they are commanded to put on clothing, to dress themselves, because by dressing themselves, they're taking control of the environment. How do we differ from animals? We're able to speak, we're able to act, and we're able to take control. Animals, can they speak? Can they have a conversation? Yeah, maybe between each other. But their speech is not developed enough to cause them to action. We're meant to use all the capabilities that God gives us in order to control our reality and to manipulate our world. We put in this world to control the world, to take it to, in a way, to take advantage of the world. And that means we need to get ourselves dressed, in inverted commas. Animals can run around naked. It's not a problem. No one thinks anything if an animal runs around naked. A human being runs around naked, it's weird. It's not right. Why? Because if a person isn't dressed, you're saying you're not taking control, you're not looking after yourself. You don't have any self-dignity. You don't have any self-respect because you're not showing that you can control your environment and raise yourself to something higher. And so the most basic message of clothing and the source of clothing from the beginning is the ability for mankind to take control of their reality. Animals are part of the environment. Mankind takes control of his environment. And when you put on your clothing, you're expressing that. If it gets cold outside and it's raining, if you're a human being, you have the intellect to say, oh, it's cold outside. I'm going to be outside in the rain. Let me take an umbrella. I don't want to get wet. If it's boiling hot outside, as a human being, you have the intellect and the ability to say, I better take off a layer of clothing. I better dress appropriately. If I'm going to a job interview, like somebody said earlier, I better dress according to the occasion because as a human being, I have the ability to influence my environment. Now, I said earlier, I raised the question earlier when somebody mentioned the job interview. I said, is it manipulative to dress up for a job interview if you're generally a shlochi person? Are you creating a false sense of reality? I must be honest, I'm generally a shlochi person. But sometimes I have to put on a tie and a suit. Am I deceptive when I do that? Because it's not me. But what I'm doing is I'm showing that as a human being, I can control my environment. I can create an environment that's appropriate. When we go into shul, we dress in a certain way. There's a certain dress code because we're creating an environment. When you're sitting on the beach, there's another way of dressing because you're creating an atmosphere, you're creating an environment. When you're in the workplace, there's a dress code because it creates an environment. When you're in a school, anywhere where you are, the clothing that you wear creates an environment, but that's something that human beings have the ability to do because as human beings, we create our environment, we control our environment. That's a unique human characteristic, is that we're able to, in a way, manipulate the world and create realities that we want because God gave us this world when he created the world to advance it, to develop it, to make it our own. To go beyond nature, if you like. Animals work within nature. Human beings go beyond nature. And that's perhaps why the loss of a human being is far greater than the loss of an animal. I know some of us are very attached to our pets and we get sad when a pet dies. But in general, we're far more affected by the death of a human being than we are by the death of an animal. Why? Because in a big way, animals form the background. Pets maybe are a bit different. Let's not take your average cat or dog, but animals in general. Animals form a backdrop of creation. They're running around openly in the forest, in nature, all over, and they're forming a backdrop of the world, but they're not the driving force of the world. They're there to form part of that backdrop. Human beings are meant to be the driving force of the world and influence the world in a way that no animal can. And because we have the ability to influence the world, that means that we have to take control of the world. And clothing that comes up right at the beginning of the story of creation is an expression of really taking control. And in a way, I don't know, I keep using the word manipulating. I don't know if manipulating is the right word because it sounds negative. But of maybe empowering the world, of enabling the world, of developing the world. That's really our role. And on a metaphoric level, putting on clothing represents that. We're taking control of our environment. Okay, so that's part one. I'm going to move on now. Give me a second.
Hi. Ooh. Hello.
I'm just going to move on. If anyone has any questions in the meantime, feel free.
Hi, not a question, just a comment, but tying in with what
Yes.
you're saying.
Yes.
In my firm, we have a policy which is called dress for your day, which kind of
Right.
fits totally with that. So you dress, reflect, like recognizing that you'll dress differently depending on if we're lawyers. So if you're seeing clients who might expect you to be looking formal, you dress
More
like that.
formal.
Otherwise, you can be less formal.
So I want to ask you a question based on that. Would you say that when you have a work down day, I think that's what they call it, does that affect your productivity anyway, or does it add to your productivity? How would you?
That's a good question. I think maybe because it used to be, and actually I don't work on Fridays. It was called Dress Down Fridays, and so I think it probably did like bring in a more relaxed attitude. But now, really, and especially with the dress for your day policy came in just before COVID, and now with COVID, like when people are in the office, everyone on the whole is dressed really casually. So I don't know if that actually makes if you feel slightly less formal. Or everyone's just become used to it now because it's more unusual to see someone in a suit.
Right. So there's an interesting element over there. Is how much is it really what we're saying is really real, or how much is it just just something that we create because we have certain associations with clothing? That really leads me on to the next question. I just want to bring.
I suppose if you're dressed casually or dressed comfortably, then maybe you feel like yourself, and then you're maybe more productive because you're being who you want to be and not pretending or acting in a way for the environment.
Yes, or you could make the opposite argument that if you dress casually, then you
can't be bothered and you're a bit laid back.
Yeah, you're going to let your guard down. I'm not sure. It could go either way. Okay, I'm going to share another slide. We're going to move on now. Second.
Sorry, another question then. When it was Adam and Eve, when they were first, before they realized that they were naked or became embarrassed, I mean, it was just, as I understand, it was just the two of them. So sort of from that perspective, and given that they didn't know about clothes, that.
It's an excellent point. Who weren't they embarrassed? They weren't embarrassed. From who?
Exactly, yeah.
So seemingly the answer is themselves.
Yeah.
Meaning there's self-dignity, it's not necessarily other people. Okay, let's move on now. Before we move on, I want to play a little game. There's 4 people over here. Some of them you might recognize, some of them you might not recognize, but let's look one by one. What can you tell me about these people? Let's start on the one in the left-hand corner over here. Who do we think he is? Anybody? Anyone want to give it a go?
I would have said a rabbi figure, but I can't really see. I've only got a little screen, so a bit difficult to see.
Fair enough. I didn't make them small. It's a bit on purpose because I wanted to show you something else. But a man with a beard, okay? Famous. If you had to give him a job, what job would you give him?
Politician.
Okay, interesting. Okay, but we don't know who he is. Okay, the next, let's move down. Good guy or bad guy? Based on his clothing.
Bad.
Bad. Okay, he seems to be dressed like a Nazi.
Mhm.
But to say murderer or savior, what would you say?
Murderer.
Yeah, so you're going to answer. Okay, but at first glance, you see a photo like this, you'd say murderer. Okay, the next one it's more well known.
The Queen.
It's the Queen.
The Queen. She's trying to hide away. But if you didn't know the picture, lady with a scarf and a jacket. Famous, not famous?
Not famous.
Average old lady on a train, right? Okay, you know the picture, so you know. Lady at the bottom. What would you say about her? This lady over here.
Eccentric.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was gonna say crazy.
Kind of media celebrity.
Media celebrity. Okay, interesting. Let's look
Like
at
something out of Fab.
Okay. Let's look at who the 4 people actually are. First one at the top is Ruby Rivlin, Israel's former president.
Mhm.
When he used to go out into the street and he didn't want people to know who he was, he used to dress up so that he could walk around like in inverted commas, like a normal person. Okay. Somebody said that person was a politician, but It's not the statesman figure of Ruby Rivlin with his tie and his suit and his little flag pinned to him. Very different looking figure over there with a different dress code. Let's move down. The gentleman at the bottom, he was a Nazi, or he worked as a Nazi, but that was on his uniform because behind the scenes, he actually was awarded a Righteous Amongst the Nation award because he saved countries in the Holocaust. He used his position to give Jews special exit visas and leave Lithuania. So his dress code says he's a villain, but in reality, he was actually a hero. Okay, the Queen looks far more like the Queen when she's dressed like the Queen. And the lady at the bottom is actually a beggar. As a beggar, she wanted to have dignity. So when she went out, she dressed up. But it's the same beggar dressed up nicely as the same beggar asking for money over there. So I'm going back to the question that we started off with. We said that up till now we said that clothing is there for us to control our reality. That's how man differs from animals, is that when we put on clothes, we have the ability to create a reality. If that's so, that clothing allows mankind to manipulate the world or to change the world, whatever we want to call it, then how much does clothing really define us? Or is clothing something just superficial? What do we think?
Sorry, can you repeat that? My Wi-Fi.
Oh, sorry,
Just
might have
got
been
so
mine. Sorry, it might have been
official.
mine. Can you hear me?
Not-
Someone give me a thumbs up if you can hear me properly.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me? Okay, so I was asking, how much do our clothing, if wearing clothing is our way of manipulating our environment as people, how much does clothing then distort reality? Or how much does it make reality? Meaning, is the queen when she wears her fancy clothing with her fancy hats and designer specially made clothing for her? Or she's still the queen even when she gets on a train dressed like one of the nation? How much of our clothing is us? And when you all get dressed in the morning, how much does your clothing define who you are? And how much are people looking at your clothing to define you?
I think it's two separate things. The Queen's always the Queen, and we expect that because she is the Queen, but somebody on the street doesn't expect me to be wearing something because I'm who I am. They don't know me.
So for politicians, it plays a role. For the famous, it plays a role. But for the average person, it doesn't really define us in any way.
It might define me as a person if I choose to put on, if you know that you dress one way and you decide to put on clothes that just are not you, only I would know that. Okay, my close friends might know that, but somebody on the street wouldn't know whether I'm dressing modestly, for instance, or however I'm dressed, or choosing not to dress. And if I go out in a pair of trousers, nobody knows that I wouldn't maybe not normally wear a pair of trousers. But if I'm wearing,
so you're the type of person that doesn't really think about what you wear in the morning?
I might think about what I'm wearing, as in, am I going somewhere and want to be a little bit smarter, or am I going to spend most of the day in the kitchen and I'm just going to put on something that's, it's going to end up in the wash in 5 minutes. I do think about what I wear a bit. Most of the time I look in the wardrobe and think, oh gosh, I could do with some new clothes. That sort of thinking, what am I wearing? But all my clothes are me. I don't have anything in there that's not me. I obviously have my smarter Shabbos clothes, but I have my weekday clothes, and that's who I am.
Okay. So then let me ask you, all of you, is what do our clothing do for us? What's the function of your clothing? Some of us spend more time deciding what we're going to wear, some of us less. A lot of us like retail therapy for a reason. And I'm a man and also like shopping, so it's okay. But what are we doing when we go shopping? What are we doing when we go to our closet in the morning? What function does our clothing have?
It's multifunctional.
Go on.
Part of it is, as it were, protective. So like you were saying, it was raining, you put on clothes to keep you dry, clothes to keep us warm, clothes that are cooler for hot weather. Part of it is decorative. I think for most people, it's decorative, whether you're male or female, so you might choose. It also then, you adapt it for different circumstances, like if you're going to work or if you're going to school or if you're doing whatever. So that, yeah, I think it has a number of functions.
Excellent. Okay, so let's go back to our story in creation, and with this I'll end. When Adam and Eve realized that they are naked and they have no clothes on, they quickly take some leaves and they cover themselves. That's really the first item of clothing that they have. It's the first item of clothing in the world. It says the Torah, the eyes of both of them were opened and they knew that they were naked. They sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. What's the point of those clothes? Oh my word, they realize they're naked, they realize they're exposed, they don't feel comfortable, and they cover themselves. So the function of those clothing that Adam and Eve make for themselves are very basic, just to cover themselves. And that's why the word that the Torah uses is a kasut, a covering. Later on in the story, when God expels them from the garden and he sends them into the world out there to, like we say, is to manipulate the world and to control the world, God then gives them clothing. And this time, God doesn't give them a covering, he gives them a ketonet. Now, ketonet I've translated over here as a coat. But where else do we know the word ketonet from? Anyone know where we see the word ketonet elsewhere in the Torah?
Yosef.
Excellent, from Joseph. And with Joseph, what's the ketonet that he wears?
Hasin. Hasin.
Ketonet Hasin, a coat of many colors. It brings out the beauty and the glory and the majesty that Joseph is, the favorite son. Where else do we see it in the Torah? There's one more time we see the word ketonet.
With the
High priest.
Excellent, the high priest. And why does the high priest wear his clothing? Again, because he's the representative of God. It's almost like his cape, like his royal garments. And so God, when he dresses Adam and Eve, he says to Adam and Eve, you guys have just covered yourselves. I want your clothing to have an extra layer to it. I want your clothing to bring out the best of who you are. And so clothing, therefore, in Bereshit has two different functions. Next week, we'll see a third. But for the meantime, clothing has two different functions. It's there to cover us up, to protect us. You feel exposed, you feel vulnerable. As mankind, you take control of his environment, you cover yourself. It's raining outside, you put on a raincoat. You're cold, you put on a coat. It's functional. That's the first function of clothing. And then there's a second function of clothing, and that is to glorify us and to bring out the most of us and to celebrate who we are. God dresses Adam and Eve. He's saying it's not good enough that your clothes just are there to serve a totally auxiliary purpose. Your clothing must add to your personality. Your clothing should celebrate who you are. And therefore, God gives Adam a ketonet. And he gives Adam and Eve both a ketonet. A garment that's really going to celebrate who they are and bring out the most in them, the best in them. And so when you go into the wardrobe in the morning, there's really two questions that you ask yourself. Is the clothing that I'm going to wear, is it going to protect me from the weather outside, from the Manchester rain? Or is the clothing that I'm going to put on, in a way, is it going to bring out the most in me? Is it going to celebrate who I am and add to me? And so those are two functions of clothing that we have. We're going to look at them in more detail in the coming weeks and see how the clothes that we wear, what purpose do they have? Are they a mere covering? Do they bring out the most of us? When is it appropriate to wear clothing that's just a covering? And when is it appropriate to wear clothes that glorify us and bring out the most in us? Okay. Let's stop over there. Really gave you know what, let's not stop over there. Let's just give you a preview for next week, because there is another word for clothing that comes up. I mentioned that there's the word kasut, which is a covering, and I mentioned there was the word katonet, which means a coat that glorifies us. But the most basic word for clothing in Hebrew is begadim, a beged. And with begadim, we're going to learn about a third purpose of clothing. So I'm giving you homework for next week. What does the word beged mean? And where does the word beged come up? I'll give you a clue. Think about it for next week. Let me know if you have an answer. It comes up in the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It comes up in the Yom Kippur davening. Where do we see the word beged? The Hebrew word bet gimel dalet come up in the Rosh Hashanah, in the Yom Kippur davening. So let's end over there. In the meantime, we've said that, just to sum up, we said that Adam and Eve, when they left the Garden of Eden, they were given the ability to control their environment, manipulate the environment, take control of the world, cover themselves up. That's kasut, that's a covering. God then gave them an extra layer of clothing. Said, no, your clothing is meant to bring out the most of you, to bring out the best of you. And then we just see now a third type of clothing, that is a beged, which we'll discuss next week. Okay, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Rav Greg Bank.
Thank you.
As usual, you always present in such a creative, lively, accessible way. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure we're all just waiting in suspense for next week's follow-up share. So thank you again for
Thank
being
you
our
for
guest
having me.
speaker tonight.
Sure. Thanks. Cheers.
Cheers. Okay, we'll start with my share in about give you just a few minutes if you want to make coffee, if you want to leave, if you want to stay, whatever you want to do. We'll start in a few minutes, 2 more minutes. Give it 2 minutes.
Look in there.
Okay. Okay. Hi. Hi, everybody. Oh, we have some people from America over here. Hi, Dad. Thanks for coming. Nice to see you. Okay, really excited for Hosea. It's got some powerful stuff. All right, are we ready to begin? Can everybody see the source sheet?
Yeah.
Yes, we're good. Okay, amazing. Hold on. Oh,